And welcome everyone to today's local government education program provided by the University of Illinois Extension. My name is Mike Delaney and I'm a community and economic development educator for University of Illinois Extension. We're happy to welcome back Aaron Hurley from the National Association of Counties, or NACo, based in Washington, D.C. Aaron staffs NACo's Finance, Pensions, and Intergovernmental Affairs Policy Steering Committee, where she works with county officials across the nation to set NACo's policies on matters pertaining to the financial resources of counties, fiscal management, federal assistance, municipal borrowing, county revenues, federal budget, federal tax reform, elections, and Native American issues. She also has staffed the Human Services and Education Policy Steering Committee, serves as the staff liaison to NACo's Immigration Reform Task Force, and staffs the National Association of County Intergovernmental Relations Office. We want to invite participants to add questions to the chat space anytime during the presentation, and we'll try to address as many as we can during the Q&A session following Aaron's presentation. Finally, I'd like to remind everybody that all registrants will receive the PowerPoint slides, the links to resources, and a recording of today's webinar. We'd like to thank Erin for her time in preparing this presentation for us today. And Erin, I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mike, for that introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. As Mike said, I am Erin Hurley. I serve as the Associate Legislative Director for NACo's Finance, Pensions, and Intergovernmental Affairs portfolio. And again, prior to that, handled Human Services and Education for NACo. So we've been around for a little over 5 years. Just want to thank Nancy, Mike, and the University of Illinois Extension for having me back again this year. And also want to say thank you to the United Counties Council of Illinois for their partnership and support throughout the years as well. As many of you know, our goal here at NACo is to advocate for county priorities and federal policymaking. And while doing so, we need our intergovernmental partners from the administration, various federal agencies, and Congress. This pandemic has demonstrated that our continued success as a nation, we must have cooperation at the state, local, and federal level. As a nation, we are all facing hardships due to the pandemic and economic recession. So just want to take a moment to thank all of you that are participating on this meeting today, who are truly the boots on the ground and champions of this public health crisis. And Nancy, could we jump to the next slide, please? Before jumping into our federal policy update, this year, NACo has put together a breadth of information and resources to help serve our communities. So as you'll see on the screen, NACo has created a
Erin,
Yes.
It looks like your sound is substantially breaking in and out for everybody. Okay. Everybody's pretty much sounding in the same fashion. I don't know if you need to adjust anything on your end, but wanted to let you know. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Nancy. Is this a little bit better?
We'll see. I might pop back in.
Okay, sorry about that. So as you can all see on the screen, NACo has created 2 resource hubs. First is our COVID-19 resource hub, which really houses many other resource hubs, including the Coronavirus Relief Fund Resource Hub, known as the CRF, which was authorized under the CARES Act, and many other pages and reports to connect you with county best practices, new county level data, and much more as we work together during this time. In addition to our COVID-19 resources, NACo has also created a new advocacy toolkit hub that equips you with the tools to connect with your members of Congress and federal agencies. And you can find both toolkits and resource hubs and all of the information you could possibly need on NACo's website at naco.org. And Nancy, if we could jump to the next slide, please.
Yes, and you're still experiencing quite a bit of sound, and I'm not for sure if it's maybe you have a battery powered or you need to plug in, plug out. You could also, if as a last resort, if you wanted to call in speakerphone with the call-in information, you could do that as well.
Okay, let me just try to reconnect one more time. And then if that doesn't work, then I'll call in.
Okay, sounds good. And we'll get the call-in number, meeting ID, and password in the chat box for you if you need it.
Okay. Okay. Great. I'll try this one more time. And then if that doesn't work, then I can go ahead and call in. All right. If we could just hop to the next slide. Thank you so much. So as you all know, counties provide many essential services, especially for our most vulnerable residents, and support small businesses that are ultimately the lifeblood of our counties and our economy. And while the pandemic rages on and the need for a stronger intergovernmental relationship at the county, tribal, state, and federal level is ultimately vital to our nation's recovery. With that really comes a need for a nationwide approach so that we can move from that response phase to a recovery phase. And as counties, our responsibilities, which are ultimately often mandated by state and federal governments, are incredibly vast. Counties operate over 900 hospitals, 800 long-term care facilities, and 1,900 health departments. We also provide services to local communities with 530,000 employees in health and hospitals, including 329,000 hospital workers and 201,000 public health workers. Additionally, we are responsible for emergency operations centers and 911 services, court and jail management, public safety and emergency response, protective services for children, seniors, and veterans, and the last of the first responders, which are the coroners and medical examiners, just to name a few. And if we could go to the next slide, please, Nancy. Thank you. So what this slide is just trying to portray as we are setting the scene again for the legislative update really here, and some of the work that NACo is going to be doing over the next year. We understand now that we again are moving to that recovery phase that counties will play a very large role in the implementation of the COVID-19 vaccination programs. A number of the elements identified as critical to the execution of vaccine deployment are county owned or operated. So this includes emergency management agencies, local health departments, hospitals and health systems, community health centers, rural health clinics, and long-term care facilities. From the beginning of this national crisis.
Thank you, Erin. I'm going to have to ask you to call in with your phone because the fluctuation in volume is too significant that I'm afraid that.
I'm very sorry about that.
Oh, that's fine.
Nancy, would you like me to pause the recording while she's getting set up again?
Oh yeah, hit pause. That'd be great.
I'm going to do that.
Hi again, everyone. So sorry for that technical difficulty there. So just hopping right back into things. So from the beginning of this national crisis, counties have really faced persistent critical supply shortages and budget shortfalls, while also working within a public health infrastructure that has been underfunded for years. As COVID cases continue to rise daily, and we anticipate this rise well into the winter, the strain of these already struggling institutions will be enormous. Another area of stress for local governments is the high unemployment rate that has disproportionately affected local government job sectors. Early in the pandemic, counties really have faced massive budget furloughs and layoffs, and local government employment continues to be well below the lowest levels of the Great Depression. Despite the recent job gains seen across the country in October, nearly all major industries remain below February employment levels, and the economic situation remains largely unstable. In fact, October as well as November marked continued job loss in local government. And then Nancy, if we could just jump to the next slide, please. Thank you. So as you can see on the screen, currently counties anticipate a $202 billion impact to their budgets through fiscal year 2021.
This figure includes $114 billion in lost county-generated revenue, $30 billion in additional COVID-19 response expenditures, and then an estimated $58 billion in state funding cuts. These impacts are causing county leaders to cut or reduce services to residents, delay or cancel infrastructure projects, and lay or furlough American workers. County budgets are threatened by reduced income from tax revenue streams, and many counties are primarily, if not almost entirely, funded by property taxes, and concerns mount on the stability of the future property tax revenue streams. Actually, we found from a NACo study that in 42 states, counties receive over 50% of the revenues from property tax in 2017, and that we found that states took some direct action to offer tax relief by enacting legislation or executive orders to authorize the extension of property tax deadlines. Ultimately, the financial fallout of COVID-19 has forced cuts and delays in capital investments, and NACo research finds that 66% of counties have cut or delayed infrastructure maintenance, and 54% have cut or delayed new infrastructure projects. Ultimately, these cuts will mitigate cash flow shortages in the short term, but will have those long-term economic impacts and ultimately disrupt critical local economic development. We are ultimately, as local governments, of course, we have a range of impacts, but in an effort prior to the fourth COVID-19 relief package that Congress signed into law at the end of the year, end of 2020, NACo actually conducted a COVID relief survey that we partnered with not only public sector, but also private sector, just to see kind of across the board what the impact of the pandemic has had on both sectors. So Nancy, if you could advance that slide. Thank you so much. So as you can see from these numbers, we found that both the public and private sectors have really taken a hit from the pandemic. In fact, 89% of respondents indicated that their businesses and organizations or government is worse off now than in January of 2020. Without an additional aid or intervention, 95% of business respondents believe their organization or industry will face significant challenges, or worse, will be forced to close their doors. And then taking a specific look at local governments, 72% of respondents indicated that their financial health has been negatively impacted by COVID-19, and most will face challenges in providing essential services without that additional aid. So in sum, we asked again both private sector and public sector about the impact of COVID-19. When asking the specific question about the need for additional aid from our federal partners, 91% of those respondents believe that if Congress does not pass another stimulus bill, their businesses, organizations, and government conditions will ultimately will worsen. So it's really clear here that this survey it paints a very clear picture that if Congress fails to act on a coronavirus relief bill, millions of jobs will be lost, small businesses could permanently close, and vital government services will be cut. And then Nancy, could we please advance to the next slide, please? Thank you. So that brings us to kind of where we've been in most recent months. Thankfully, Congress, they have taken some steps to ease the financial burden on state and local governments. Since March, Congress and the administration have worked together to adopt 4 different federal aid packages, with the first 2 bills much more targeted at public health strategies, food assistance for kids and older adults, and also enhanced federal support for paid sick and family leave. And then the third package, which folks joining today are probably the most familiar with, is the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, also known as the CARES Act. And most importantly, that legislation established that $150 billion coronavirus relief fund for state and local governments to address COVID-19 expenses. Again, as many of you know, these funds gave direct aid to local governments with populations of over 500,000 to address necessary expenditures incurred due to the public health emergency. And while, you know, we are aware that the CARES Act was an important first step, the federal aid appropriated to state and local governments just simply is not enough to support our intergovernmental efforts to preserve the health and safety of our residents. Just one of the most significant areas in which, you know, NACo felt was a missed opportunity when it comes to the CARES Act, and again, specifically the Coronavirus Relief Fund, was that it did not provide funding to offset drastic revenue shortfalls that county governments are experiencing across the country. As I mentioned, that $202 billion loss throughout fiscal year 2021. And of course, it did not provide any sort of direct federal aid to local governments with populations under 500,000. And actually, it only did provide that direct aid to, as I mentioned, populations above 500,000, which is equivalent to only 5% of the nation's counties. So then after the CARES Act, it took several months later for Congress and the Trump administration to come to a consensus on the next COVID relief package. Ultimately, right before the end of the year, on December 27th, Congress passed and President Trump signed a massive $2.3 trillion legislative package that contained both appropriations for 2021 and additional COVID-19 relief. This, of course, is the largest COVID relief round since that $2 trillion CARES Act that was signed into law. And unfortunately, although NACo was heavily involved in negotiations and able to secure numerous victories for counties, we were very disappointed to see that this package did not include that direct, additional direct and flexible aid to state and local governments. However, one of the largest wins did include an extension of the deadline for counties using those coronavirus relief fund dollars until December 31st of 2021. That original deadline was supposed to be December 30th of 2022. So with that extended deadline, ultimately it does provide states and local governments, especially again, those that did not receive direct payments from the U.S. Treasury, but received sub-allocations from their states, that they just have a longer timeline to spend those dollars, and again, more flexibility. So, and then in addition to those other, oh, sorry, Nancy, could we just go back really quickly? Thank you so much. Sorry about that. And then just really quickly wanted to highlight some key provisions in that most recent relief package, that it provided $8.75 billion in new funding to assist with vaccine development and distribution. Of this total, there was actually $4.5 billion that was made available in direct grants to states and localities. The deal also extends the pandemic unemployment programs by 11 weeks, and the supplemental unemployment insurance benefits by $300 per week through March of 2021. It also re-upped the payment protection program to support small businesses, and it also includes $25 billion towards a new rental assistance program, where it's set up sort of similar to the Coronavirus Relief Fund, where counties with populations of 200,000 residents and above can receive direct assistance from the U.S. Department of Treasury that can be used towards rental assistance. And then finally, there was a slew of various funding pots that would assist children's families and individuals, and it also contained $45 billion for transportation. And then finally, the last part that I did want to mention for that most recent relief package is that it did include $300 million towards the broadband infrastructure program. And then, Nancy, could we hop to the next slide, please? Thank you so much. So that brings me to where we are kind of right now. Lucky for us, President Biden has been very vocal in recognizing the vital role of counties in ending the pandemic. He recently announced his two-part plan for the next round of COVID relief and our nation's recovery journey. The nearly $2 trillion package includes $350 billion for emergency state and local aid funding, which of course would be a huge win for state and local governments across the country. And then just want to kind of highlight a couple of other key provisions that you see on the screen. The Biden administration's plan would also establish a national vaccine plan, and it would also allocate $20 billion to state, local, and tribal governments and territories to launch a national vaccine plan. And the plan would also provide $50 billion for the expansion of COVID-19 testing and another $30 billion into the FEMA disaster relief fund for supplies and protective gear. It would also renew the Family First Coronavirus Response Act Emergency Paid Leave Program, which it would be extended until September 30th of 2021. What was really key, actually, though, in the Biden administration's plan, though, is that in addition to extending that program, it would also make public sector employers, including counties, eligible to receive that payroll tax credit. And you may remember that both in the Family First Coronavirus Response Act, as well as the most recently passed COVID-19 year-end spending deal, counties were still excluded from receiving those payroll tax credits. So that was definitely a provision that we were very happy to see and that NACo has been heavily engaged in since the FFCRA was signed into law. The plan would also provide new assistance, including temporarily expanding the child tax credit, as well as the earned income tax credit, and also allocate an additional $1 billion to the Federal Public Assistance Program, also known as the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. And then finally, just a couple more provisions. It would allocate $170 billion for education stabilization, most notably going towards the safe reopening of schools, and then $3 billion in nutrition assistance, and then an additional $20 billion to support public transit. And ultimately, right now, what we're hoping to do is that, while the administration has changed, NACo's stance has not, especially around some of the top priorities that we are hoping to work on. We continue to call and work with the Biden administration for direct, flexible aid to counties of all sizes, and ultimately are hoping that our federal partners recognize us as good stewards of taxpayer dollars. So within the last couple of days, we've seen, a lot of renewed efforts around negotiations for a COVID-19 stimulus package or rescue plan, whatever you may call it. Actually, just over the weekend, there was a group of 16 bipartisan members of Congress that met with the Biden administration to partake in those COVID-19 negotiations. During those conversations, and actually just on Monday, President Biden stated that he was prepared to provide just a couple weeks for Congress to reach a bipartisan deal on coronavirus aid before potentially triggering the budget reconciliation process, which of course is when the Senate just needs a majority vote. Ultimately, though, President Biden has also noted as well, too, that instead of using that reconciliation process, he really is hoping for bipartisan consensus and support of his almost, $2 trillion pandemic relief plan. We know that, potentially, especially the Senate in the past has expressed some unease with the size of the Biden administration's package and some of its provisions, specifically the push for increasing the federal minimum wage and the aid to state and local governments. But that's all to say in sum is that the White House, again, after those negotiations over the weekend and continuing into this week, the administration has stated that they acknowledge that they don't expect the final COVID relief bill to look like the one that is proposed or the original one that they proposed. And again, ultimately hope to work in a bipartisan fashion over the next few weeks. And then Nancy, could we jump to the next slide, please? Thank you. So in addition to COVID relief, of course, the Biden administration has also highlighted other priorities for the administration in its first 100 days. So I really mostly want to focus on the COVID vaccine distribution plan, and then just going to quickly touch on those other ones. So on January 15th, President Biden and his administration unveiled the outline for a national COVID-19 vaccination strategy, which seeks to address the challenges, of course, faced by local governments in distributing the vaccine. This is a 5-part plan, and it outlines key actions that the Biden administration will work to take at the federal level to aid the efficient and equitable vaccination of U.S. residents. So some of those key steps and actions include, first, increasing the number of vaccinations by encouraging states to open vaccine availability to other priority groups, and ultimately ensuring an equitable distribution to a number of different populations. Another action item is leveraging federal agency resources to create more local vaccination sites through the development of mobile vaccination clinics that will reach underserved urban areas and rural communities as well. Another action is increasing the supply of COVID-19 vaccines to be deployed as quickly as possible through the enactment of the Defense Production Act. A fourth step is mobilizing additional personnel to get more shots in the arms, with a commitment to invest in an additional 100,000 new public health workers that will work with their communities, again, to provide vaccine outreach and contact tracing services, as well as more of the long-term goal and support to address ongoing threats to public health. And then finally, another approach that they are taking is launching a public education campaign to improve vaccine confidence in the general public as well. And then you'll see there as well, too, I'm going to touch on infrastructure in just a second, but of course, the Biden administration has also noted that this is one of their top priorities in the first 100 days, and has been working diligently with Congress as the new leadership on those committees of jurisdiction are partaking in those negotiations. When it comes to climate change, we know that the Biden administration plans to issue a number of executive orders and roll back many of those that were issued under the Trump administration. And then finally, immigration reform. Going into the Biden administration, we know that this has been a top priority. In fact, on the first day, the president unveiled his immigration proposal, and since then has actually stated that rather than an entire overhaul of the immigration system, he would be interested in, again, negotiating with Congress to do a more step-by-step approach to that as well. And then Nancy, could we jump to the next slide, please? And then in terms of what NACo plans to work on in the upcoming year, you know, and it's have to definitely touch on this, is that, you know, speaking of change in the administration, there's also been some change in Congress. The 2 Democrat senators from Georgia won their runoff elections in January, giving Democrats a narrow majority in both the House and Senate. Ultimately, regardless of who is in control of Congress, NACo will continue to fight for that additional COVID aid, and we haven't lost sight of other important issues for counties and residents. So as you can see on the screen, and how NACo identifies these kind of top priorities is that each year our board of directors actually takes part in a voting process. So just wanted to outline some of the key items that NACo will continue to work on throughout this year. First and foremost is strengthening our nation's intergovernmental partnership and ultimately restoring that balance of federalism. We're also hoping to secure a comprehensive infrastructure package that includes consideration and funding for local governments, of course, who own and operate, you know, 40% of our nation's public roads and bridges. We also already know that the president's choice for the Secretary of Transportation, Mayor Pete Buttigieg, understands the critical role that counties play when it comes to our nation's infrastructure system. Another priority that NACo will continue to work on is criminal justice reforms, while also, of course, addressing mental health and substance abuse disorders. One of the major ways that NACo has been working on this over the past couple of years is that we established a task force with the National Sheriff's Association on the Medicaid inmate exclusion policy. And then our next advocacy goal, and has really been a staple over many years for NACo, is for funding for the Payment in Lieu of Taxes program, as well as the Secure Rural Schools program. And then we also, of course, seek to enhance and kind of address some of the federal rulemaking process, especially with regard to the Environmental Protection Agency. And then another issue that's especially important to counties is boosting broadband deployment, and also removing state and federally imposed barriers to prevent us from actually providing reliable internet to our residents as well. In this realm too, I do have to mention that over the last couple of weeks, NACo actually announced the formation of our new broadband task force. And what this task force does is actually it brings together over 36 county officials, along with the input of countless others, to address some of the root causes of the digital divide. Of course, broadband and the access to broadband has really been highlighted during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now that we are working from home, children are, partaking in online learning. So again, this broadband task force is really trying to address some of those largest issues that we are faced with today. And then finally, just around election security and integrity, this is just another priority that NACo will continue to work over the next year. And then, so with that, that concludes my presentation. Again, thank you so much for bearing with me with the technical difficulty. Very, very sorry about that. But with that, just thank you so much for inviting me to be here today, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Terrific. Thank you, Erin. Appreciate that very much for that informative and comprehensive presentation. We have time for questions. There's one comment that's been posted is that it would be useful to get the budgetary amounts breakdown mentioned, but not listed on the slide. Perhaps a reference to slide 9 when you get your slide deck in the mail will address that.
And sorry, Mike, if I may just,
Sure.
Sorry, if I may just jump in really quickly. So regarding that budget slide, NACo actually did come out with a report where specifically how we got that number was that we surveyed a large portion of NACo's members to assess the fiscal impact on county budgets. So we actually put out a whole report that kind of articulates, like, not only the budget impacts, but the unemployment rates, the impact that property tax and online sales tax has had on counties because of the pandemic. So I'm happy to actually pass along that link in the chat as well too, if that's helpful.
That sounds like a great resource. To the folks in the audience, feel free to post your questions. Erin, maybe I'd be interested to hear your input. You'd mentioned with the new administration's proposals approaching almost $2 trillion, and the issue of support for county and local governments having been problematic in the past. What's your sense as your organization communicates with the folks on the Hill about the support in Congress for these proposals by the administration for that additional state and local support?
Yeah, Mike, that's a really great question. I think on that point, what would be most helpful is if you are able to tell your county stories, how your budgets have been impacted as a result of COVID-19, what your unemployment rates look like, what kind of services you are providing to your residents. Because what we found that, of course, data is very, very helpful, but having that county story and being able to, again, just articulate what is happening at the local level with your communities and residents, I think will be really, really helpful when speaking to your members of Congress.
Would your organization be a conduit for those contacts?
Definitely, yes. NACo can connect you with any sort of congressional office, and we are happy to help in whatever way. Ahead of the most recent COVID-19 relief package, NACo actually created template letters for many state association of counties or just counties as well. And so we are more than happy to work with you in any way to help assist in your advocacy efforts.
Okay, we have a question. Are there particular issues that counties are reporting around capacity to respond to the pandemic? Has HR been a core concern that NACo has responded to?
So yes, I mean, there have definitely been, we're hearing from a lot of members about capacity wise. I mean, the hospitals, long-term care facilities, the coroner's offices, they are just very, very overwhelmed because of COVID-19. As I mentioned in the fiscal impact slide, but maybe it didn't go into too much detail on this, is that a lot of the things that we've heard about as well too is that with the new paid leave program, while it provides great support, there's also a lot of paperwork that's associated with it and other federal programs that have been established by those various relief packages, because since there are new reporting requirements, new programs being established. However, at the same time, county budgets are being impacted at such a heightened rate that they do not have the staff capacity to do all of this work. So, that's all to say that there is impact from each step of the way. And this is something that NACo is going to continue tracking. Again, I mentioned the fiscal impact survey that we're doing. We also plan to do another round of that survey as well and kind of take a deeper dive into not only the fiscal impacts, but across the board, what is really happening at the local level.
Interesting. NACo publishes those survey results for its members, I would presume.
Yes, we do. And again, I'll drop into the chat right here the fiscal impact survey, but also NACo has surveyed members about a county needs assessment survey. We've also conducted surveys specifically regarding the coronavirus relief fund and how counties are spending those dollars, if they do need a deadline extension. So we do always post those reports on that COVID-19 resource hub that I mentioned. So there are a lot of reports, federal policy analyses that we've come out with. So that webpage in general is a great resource to point to, again, with our survey results or really county best practices and how they're spending the federal dollars that they're receiving. So yes, all of those are public.
Another question, as we look to the broadband solutions in the issues that you alluded to, is there an opportunity to explore e-government solutions?
That's a great question. So we haven't heard too much about the e-government solution, and I'm happy to connect with the individual that asked that question, because one of my colleagues, Arthur Scott, he does specifically work on broadband and is spearheading that broadband task force. So we would be more than willing to have that type of conversation, since that does fall into the realm of broadband.
Any questions from any of our other participants today? Anything in particular? Okay, good. We've got in the chat, you've posted the link to the fiscal impact policy report. That's great. How about anticipated shifts that might occur with respect to energy policy? and its impact on county and local resources?
So another great question, and I know that I mentioned climate change as we were talking about the Biden administration's first 100 days. So I think that's all to say, it is still early on, but again, we know that the administration has made it known that they are going to take a focus on environmental and energy issues. And again, planning to come out with, a broad range of executive orders in their first 100 days. I also will say too that as those executive orders are being put out and that landscape around environmental issues is changing, is that NACo will be tracking each one of those items very, very closely, and we'll be reporting out on those. And if there are impacts and implications when it comes to the local level and counties, we always highlight that specific focus as well. So I think that's all to say. Again, priority for the Biden administration, and expect to see, a lot of action in those first 100 days that we will definitely be reporting on.
Thank you. At this point, we'd like to queue up one poll. Here you go. Please respond to the poll. Just click on whatever appropriate response choice works for you. We'd like to get the input on our participants' assessment of the programming today. We still have time for some questions if there's anybody at all who might have something else on their mind that they've been holding back on. Well, I would like to say thank you, Aaron, on behalf of University of Illinois Extension, for your very informative presentation. It's certainly very timely. We've got somebody who's asking if we can get a budgetary breakdown on this. So basically, take a look at the budgetary proposals and input, presumably coming from NACo. I'm going to presume that might be a resource that's available at NACo's website.
Yes, Mike, it is. It is that, again, that fiscal impact survey that NACo conducted. And again, I'll just reiterate. So from some of our findings, what we found was that, again, counties expect to have a $202 billion fiscal impact due to COVID-19, again, through FY 2021. And so that it really is a combination of both lost revenue as well as those increased expenditures as a result of course, addressing and mitigating the impacts of COVID-19. I also just do want to add as well too, included in that report, we surveyed members about the impact on those capital investment projects that I mentioned, also the cuts and delays to community services, what the impact on county workforce has looked like, and how the current federal funding that it was allocated in the CARES Act, if that's been helpful thus far, or if more is needed in order for counties to continue addressing the pandemic as well too.
Good. That's good. Well, it sounds like a good resource. There's another question about the possibility of the assistance being extended. Now, presumably that's, you alluded to that in the presentation about some of the extension of some of the deadlines.
So if I'm not mistaken, I think that might be related to maybe some of the public assistance programs, so specifically the temporary assistance for needy families program, as well as the supplemental nutrition assistance program. those programs were extended under the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, which is the bill that was passed right before the end of the year. Now what lawmakers are negotiating on is specifically what are those funding levels for each of those programs. And so I mentioned, and again, also NACo has an analysis of both President Biden's rescue plan as well as that year-end spending deal plan as well too, that I can post in the chat. But each one, both the Federal Public Assistance Program, TANF, and then the Federal Food Stamps Program, SNAP, they both received increased allocations in the Biden administration rescue plan. So again, that's all to say that we'll see. And then I think, regarding the extension of the coronavirus relief fund program that was authorized under the CARES Act, we did see that extension through December 31st of 2021.
Good, thank you. One of our colleagues says, thank you for a very informative program, and most importantly, very much appreciate your work and the important role NACo plays in serving local government. And we certainly echo that sentiment. Another observation about the budgetary breakdown, assuming that it means a breakdown of the 2 million relief package budget. That was my assumption as to what that reference was. Any final questions before we end our program? We've gotten good poll participation. Okay, another thank you coming across the line. Aaron, again, thank you on behalf of University Extension. As we mentioned earlier, the participants, the registrants will be receiving presentation materials and a link to the recording for the webinar in a follow-up email. As always, please visit our website to register for future webinars. Hopefully you find the content of the local government education series valuable, not only generally, but also specifically in your daily work. You can locate those events, the schedule at go.illinois.edu/LGE. So on that note, thank you again. And we hope to see you back for future presentations.